Can an ancient book like the Bible still speak to us?
Well, some people see it as a holy book, and the thing about that is it's a holy book amongst other holy books, so you might show it respect, but you certainly would never want to read it. So that's a common attitude. You might want a copy on your shelf, but you certainly want it to gather dust rather than anything else.
In a modern, enlightened world, can the Bible really be offering timeless wisdom for all generations? The Bible, why does it endure? Part 3 on this Day of Discovery. Located in Cambridge, England, Dr. Peter Williams leads a research center called Tyndale House. Scholars from around the world come to explore subjects like archaeology, examine biblical manuscripts, or to trace the history and use of languages within the Bible.
What we have here, it's not the biggest library in the world, but it's one of the most focused for the study of the Bible.
Some of their academic investigation even addresses accusations that challenge the very foundations and credibility of the Bible itself.
There's been a story going around for at least 30 years which has been saying that when Christians gained power in the 4th century, when Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian, that's when things were corrupted. Before that point, perhaps there was some better, nice form of Christianity, but after that point, then when they got power, they began to change the Bible and so on.
The Bible claims to present an accurate record of the real history of the human race. It's been said to have been written by 40 authors over a period of 1,600 years. It's a collection of 66 books. But has it been tampered with over time? To some, its pages contain myths and legends. Yet after 2,000 years, millions continue to cherish the Bible as a revelation from God.
For those who do have questions about the Bible, I think many of the questions are, has it been reliably handed down to us? How do we know which books should be in the Bible? Who chose those books? Was there some political element that came in and corrupted what books should be in the Bible, and so on? And then all the questions about whether things in the Bible are fair, whether they happened, and so on. So those are questions that people have.
For some, the Bible has the reputation of being like a bully, or worse.
Well, obviously, anything can be taken and used in different ways, and people can use the Bible for bad things. But you can't reject the Bible on that basis. It's a bit like saying science causes wars, because after all, if we didn't have science, we wouldn't have nuclear bombs and so on.
But critics point to the Bible's Old Testament that they believe endorses violence on a large scale.
One of the things that's been happening recently has been the association between religion and violence, particularly since 9/11. And so some of the atheists have been really making objections and saying, one of the things that these people who caused that terrible destruction at 9/11 thought was that God was telling them to go and kill other people. Well, isn't that what happened in the Old Testament, where the Israelites were told to go and kill the Canaanites? In other words, they say the Old Testament is just like those terrorists of 9/11. And even if people who follow the Old Testament, Christians, are not themselves terrorists, the argument is the sort of book they have incites to violence. So what they're wanting to say is it's been the case with the Crusades, with the witch hunts and so on. Religion and violence go together. Now, of course, one of the things we do need to say about history is there isn't a constant association between religion and violence. Atheists during the 20th century, such as Mao in China and Stalin in Russia, caused far more destruction than anyone in the name of religion in history. And of course, the various things such as the witch hunts, which people say it was the religious who caused those. In fact, the evidence is that generally the Christian courts did not convict the witches, whereas the lynch mobs and the secular courts did. So we've got to retell the story. In the Old Testament, in the beginning, in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, God describes his pattern, his ideal. And so however much violence and warfare we read in the Old Testament after that, we must not think of that as part of God's ideal. Often you read about wars in the Old Testament, and it's not saying this was a good thing. When you read many oracles of judgment in the Old Testament, you might get the impression that God somehow delights in bringing about destruction. But the reason you hear so much about judgment in the Old Testament is precisely because of God's mercy. God is so merciful that he doesn't immediately judge. And so he constantly sends prophets saying he's going to bring judgments. And so it's precisely because he is delaying the judgments that you hear about the judgments. So actually the Old Testament is full of delayed judgment, delayed judgment, delayed judgment.
The conquest of Canaan, or the Promised Land, by Joshua and the armies of Israel is often offered by critics of the Bible as evidence of a violent Old Testament God grabbing land.
So one of the things that happens in the Old Testament is that Joshua is commanded to go in and destroy the Canaanites. And people might say, well, isn't that genocide? We've got to read the narrative very carefully. What happens in Joshua chapter 2 is you have the narrative of how 2 spies are sent to Jericho. And in that narrative, these 2 spies, just by chance, as it seems, happen to go to the one house of the one woman in the whole city who's seeking after God. Well, is it just chance? Of course it isn't. It's showing right at the beginning how God continues to have compassion on particular individuals who seek after him. So what we find is, in fact, as the Old Testament narrative continues, the Canaanites are being punished for their wickedness, not for their race. And this is confirmed because when Israel becomes as wicked, they are likewise punished and driven from the land.
But of the cities of these peoples which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God.
One of the things we know about ancient warfare is that people didn't just want to kill the other side. If they captured the other side, they wanted to torment them and execute them in the most humiliating way, and so on. We don't find any of that sort of thing going on in the Old Testament. Now, people might push the objection further, and they might say, well, how can God command the destruction even of children that you have in the Old Testament? And that's, of course, a very difficult question. One of the things I'd want to say up front is, of course, that we mustn't assume that we always need to have an answer to a question. That is, if an objection is going to be valid, it needs to prove not that I don't have an answer, but that no answer exists. For instance, that God knows no answer, which is, of course, a lot harder thing to prove. But one of the things we do know is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their own children. This is suggested both by archaeological evidence and by the Old Testament narrative. Now, if that's the case, then there was a child welfare issue already.
When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices witchcraft, or a soothsayer, or one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead.
It may be the case, an omniscient God might know that it was the case, that through what he commanded, more children would be spared, fewer children would be hurt than otherwise. We don't know that, but it's at least a possibility.
Dr. Peter Williams leads a study center called Tyndale House in Cambridge, England. Here, scholars research a wide range of biblical subjects, including the apparent contradictions in the Bible.
Now, one of the things that I find is often when people talk about contradictions in the Bible, they're at this very surface level. And they tend to be using what I would call low-quality contradictions. That is, they're saying one passage doesn't fit with another because words are used in different ways. So, for instance, they might say, well, in Matthew 5, it says that the law was abolished, And in Ephesians, it was not abolished, it is not to be abolished. But in Ephesians 2, the law was abolished. Or they might say that in Galatians and Romans, people are justified apart from works, whereas in James, they're justified through their works. But we just need to look at these passages and realize that the words are being used in different ways. But what we do not have in the Bible is the sort of contradictions that you could not possibly reconcile. Imagine a list of the 12 disciples, and it said, these are the list of the 12 disciples. Well, it's Mary, Martha, Chloe Iscariot, who betrayed him, and so on, and just a completely different list of people. We could have a verse in the Bible, imagine it if it said, in one place, well, Jesus was born in Nazareth, and in another, he was born in Bethlehem, or he was born in Egypt and he was born in Bethlehem. We don't have those sort of verses in the Bible.
The story of the Bible includes many personal names and places. But how do those names and places fit into the historical record?
There's good evidence for the historical reliability of the Old Testament as a whole, and this comes in the form of the personal names that you have in the Old Testament. What you find is that names go through different fashions. So for a while, Michael was the most popular male name in North America, and it's gradually decreased in popularity through time. From 1967, the name Jacob has really risen, so it became really popular around 1997. So you have different names which become popular through time. Now, one of the striking things is in the Old Testament we have lots and lots of personal names, and they go in patterns. So if I asked you to write a story about what happened 1,000 years ago and say you've got to give characters the right names, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. But what you find is in the Old Testament, the characters from that early period that you find in the first 5 books of the Bible don't have the sort of names that were around at the time of the Babylonian exile. Now, a lot of scholars like to say, you know, those books early on in the Bible were actually written around the time of the Babylonian exile. Well, one of the things we know is that a lot of Hebrew names later on ended IAH, so Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so on. And they're hugely popular around the time of Jeremiah. Do you know, not one of those sorts of names is found in those first 5 books of the Bible. It's very striking, because some people, it's taught in some universities, that the first 5 books of the Bible come from 4 different sources that they call J, E, D, and P, and were put together by 2 different editors. And this all happened at the time round about the Babylonian exile, sometime before, sometime afterwards. Well, the striking thing is, if it happened at that time when those names were so popular, why on earth did none of these authors use those sorts of names?
Archaeology is only about 200 years old, but during that time, it has confirmed the biblical record of many people, places, and events.
In the 19th century, people deciphered the ancient languages of Egypt and Babylon. Yet there were things we knew about Egypt and Babylonia from the Old Testament first. So for instance, the name of the Assyrian king, Sennacherib. Well, it was first there in the Old Testament. The Old Testament tells you that Sennacherib came and besieged Jerusalem and didn't capture it. And then after we decipher the ancient Akkadian language, then you find out that in fact he's got his own record, which confirms exactly that he came and besieged Jerusalem and didn't actually capture it.
Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem.
So you get those sort of specific details which were first known in the Old Testament. If the Old Testament were just fiction, you wouldn't have that.
According to Peter Williams, there is not only an overwhelming body of manuscript evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, but also a strong historical case that the Gospels were written within the period of the first century events that they describe.
There's some striking evidence that the Gospels are actually based on eyewitness testimony. Some of this has come out from a figure called Richard Borkham, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses in 2006. And one of the things he did was he looked at what are the personal names that people are called. and you find that the personal names that people are called really fit the pattern of what they were called back at the time of the New Testament. So you can look outside the New Testament at gravestones, at the names they put on boxes they put people's bones in. We can look at the names that you have in a historian like Josephus or in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can say, what are the most common names? Well, the most common male name was Simon. That's also the most common name inside the New Testament, where you have 8 different Jewish individuals who come from the land of Israel who are called Simon.
The story of the Bible unfolds in the landscape of the Middle East. Not only does it name specific people, but cities and mountains and bodies of water, many of which archaeology has confirmed. These names, according to Dr. Williams, provide further evidence for the historical reliability of the biblical text.
So we could find that the 4 Gospels have very detailed knowledge of the place and the sort of geography you have in the land. You find that there are little villages like Chorazin or Bethphage, which are known about. Now, how would anyone making up a story, if they lived in Turkey or Greece or Italy, know that sort of detail? How would they know the exact names of villages? They couldn't get that in maps, because maps didn't put villages like that on for travelers. Maps, if they had anything for a traveler, would put important things like big cities like Jerusalem. They wouldn't put in the villages. And how would those names be correctly handed down if it really was a question of the telephone game story of transmission, that things were just handed on from one person to another? But there's another striking feature about the names in the Gospels, and that is all 4 Gospels have between 4.6 and 4.9 place names per 1,000 words. Now, the striking thing about that is it's a very narrow band. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all fall into that narrow band of between 4.6 and 4.9 place names per 1,000 words. Now, if they were simply putting in place names in order to make their narrative authentic, it's not really conceivable that 4 writers would get so close by chance. And those numbers contrast very strongly with what you find with a lot of the apocryphal Gospels, which have fewer than 0.5 place names per 1,000 words. So really, you find, we know what fictional narratives look like. They look like those apocryphal Gospels, but the real ones just have an immense knowledge of the land.
But even if there are real names and places in the Bible, do we have the right story? Or is what we have in the Bible the result of political decisions made by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who supported the church after his conversion?
One of the common things that people say nowadays is that the books of the New Testament were selected at a time of political power in the 4th century, and that's when the Christians got together and they decided to have these 27 books in the New Testament. Now, with a lot of stories, there is actually some truth at its basis. So what we find with this story is, in fact, it is true that Christians first had their council in the 4th century. It is true that our first list of all 27 books of the New Testament comes from the 4th century. But it's wrong to say that it was really in the 4th century that these books became the scripture, that these books took on authority. I would say, in fact, the books had authority from the very beginning. They're written by either apostles or people associated with apostles. So they're all written in the time frame, if you like, of the initial contract. Christ commissioned the apostles almost like you might commission a publicity firm. And there's a certain length to their contract, and that is the length of those people as eyewitnesses. And all of the New Testament is written by people who are either in one of the apostles or in the company of the apostles. Now, some people want to say, well, when was the first list of the New Testament books? That, to me, is a distraction. And the reason why is you don't need a list of books for them to function as authoritative. That is, even if you have one book, it's still God's word. It doesn't become God's word, it's already God's word. So the day after John wrote his gospel in Ephesus, it is part of Scripture, even if the people in Jerusalem don't yet know about it. Of course, in the first few centuries of Christianity, people weren't sufficiently organized to be able to pull that all together. They were under a lot of pressure. And so it was really in the 4th century that people were first at leisure to be able to say, let's find all of the books of the New Covenant which have been written and bring them together. But it's not that those books were first given authority at that time, and it's not that other books were in the New Testament and somehow thrown out. That's not the case.
From Cambridge, England to the remotest parts of the world, tens of millions of people are still convinced that the Bible can speak to them personally as a word from God.
The really big thing that changes when you accept the authority of the Bible is that you realize that you're not in charge of your life, God is. And that means you can't just decide everything that you want to do. You can't just say, I want to do this, therefore I'm going to do this. You have to say, what does God want me to do? And a lot of people are unwilling to do that. They're unwilling to have someone else as sovereign or king in their lives. And that's really why even when people hear the arguments, they sometimes walk away because they're not willing, essentially, to give over their lives to God. But that's what we all have to do.
In first century Israel, many walked away from Jesus as God's Messiah. Some religious leaders saw him as a threat to their own power, others as a threat to their personal independence. But many did believe in Jesus and the life he offered, and were willing to die for their belief.
The benefits of giving your life over to God are absolutely huge, both eternally, where he describes the state of being with him as like a feast forever. That's the benefit, that you come to know the person who is most worth knowing. The benefit of knowing that whatever bad things you've done in the past, however much you've messed up both your own life and other people's lives, that can all be forgiven because of what Jesus Christ did in dying for our sins on the cross. That's an amazing benefit. But at the same time, I want people not just to come for the benefit. I think that we need to give our lives over to God because that's the right thing to do. And we need to realize that giving our life over to God may be a very difficult thing. Early Christians often bore witness to Christ by dying, and that was seen publicly, and many people saw it publicly and realized, even though what those people were doing was obviously so difficult, they wanted to become Christians because they wanted the hope and the assurance that those people had. And I don't want to tell anyone that if they become a Christian, their life will become easier. It may become a lot harder, but in fact, it's worth it because of the hope and the assurance knowing that this is true and that they're doing what God wants them to do.
The Bible claims to show the way to truth and life, and one generation after another have seen it as the greatest story ever told. A story of one person who gives meaning to us all.
A lot of people try to look inside themselves for meaning in life, and that's where you won't find it. One of the things that Jesus said is, whoever tries to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses it for my sake will save it. So one of the things we need to do is not look inside ourselves, we need to look to Jesus Christ. Don't look at Christians, look at Jesus Christ himself. And what you'll find is, although Christians make many mistakes, you will not be able to say that of the character of Jesus Christ. So I'd encourage people to look at the figure of Jesus Christ in the Gospels, and you will find him the most amazing figure.
Jesus stands at the center of the Bible story and at the center of history. He was born in a stable in Bethlehem and grew to manhood in the rolling hills of Nazareth. Then for just over 3 years, he taught the ways of God. He presented himself as Israel's long-awaited Messiah and the light of the world. For those claims he was crucified, and yet according to more than 500 eyewitnesses, he rose from the grave. Without Jesus, the Bible's influence would not have endured.